Good morning. I'm Diana Starson-Agdeen. I am the moderator because I showed up today. I've never done this before, so this should be a good time. I first want to start by saying thank you to the Ottawa Area Chamber of Commerce and the Legislative Action Committee for helping make this happen. Also, the Franklin County Farm Bureau Association and AT&T. I also want to thank Ryan Henningsen for not showing up today, so I have to do this. And to the Franklin County Democrats for providing refreshments today, the City of Ottawa for providing this facility and coffee, and to Matt Simonson for filming and making sure that this is on the Government Access channel where my performance here will be available in perpetuity. The next legislative coffee is Saturday, May 18th at 10 a.m., so mark your calendars. It's, I believe, the week after graduation, so there are no excuses for not being here. So with that, I'm going to start by introducing Karen Tyson, our senator, and also Blaine Finch, our representative, and let them talk a little bit about what they're expecting to happen here when we get back into session. And then we have just a few questions, and we'll turn it over to all of you.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you. I know it's a sacrifice to be here, and I appreciate you coming because it is such a gorgeous day out today. It is beautiful. I know we're going to be working cattle later today, so if anybody's bored and wants a different job, no, I'm just kidding. But the session is going to be interesting when we go back to veto session. I don't know if you guys saw yesterday the ruling from the state Kansas Supreme Court. I was not surprised but extremely disappointed at that ruling. I was reading it on the way here. For those of you that don't know, they ruled that Senate Bill 95 passed in 2015, dismemberment abortion, where you literally cut the baby and take the baby's life in order to abort. And I looked up the vote on that. It was quite intriguing. The Senate voted to pass that bill 31-9, and the House passed it 98-26. And our Supreme Court chose to rule because of our state constitution. The first Bill of Rights says the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, and that was their basis. I think this is a slippery slope. If you go on to read more of what they had talked about, they said that that they have the right to decide when they use that language and when they do not use that language. Our court is out of control. Our Supreme Court has crossed a line, and I hope that the public starts realizing it. They are legislating from the bench. So we have that in front of us. We'll have the school funding issue. They will not have hearings, I think, until May 9th. And so we may be out by then. We've heard that we could be out as soon as 2 days, or it could last. We've seen these sessions, veto sessions, go into June or July, almost July, which I hope that doesn't happen this year. We also have the tax issue. The governor vetoed Senate Bill 22. Some people think that if you look at the finances, the problem is you can't listen to the sound bites. You have to go out and look at the facts. You have to look at the numbers. We've had over $1 billion increase in the last year, and that's for K through 12 funding alone. Every dime of that went to K through 12 funding alone. In my last legislative update, the state general fund is approximately $7.1 billion. K through 12 funding is over half of that, over $3.5 billion. And if you add local and federal support for K through 12 funding, we are at $6 billion. So put that into perspective. The state management, $7.1 billion. That's not all funds, that's just the state general fund, versus 286 school districts at $6 billion. We have real issues, and as legislators, We need to balance the budget, and we need to make sure that we are being fiscally responsible with our taxpayers' money. So we do have some issues facing us when we go back to Topeka.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming out this morning. The crowd is a little more sparse than usual, but I'm sure we'll make up for that with some good questions and good conversation this morning. And like the senator said, I want to tell you how much I appreciate you being here on a nice day when there are obviously other things to do. But that's what I think is important about our system, is that people are able to come out and have conversations, and that representatives and senators make themselves available to the public to have those dialogues together. I'd also like to thank the folks who are sponsoring and the folks who brought treats this morning. It looks like there's about 18 or 20 cookies for every person in the room. So you all have some work to do between now and 11 o'clock. Veto session, typically when it started, was the time when we would go back just to consider gubernatorial vetoes and not much else. Over time, we have built in this system where we get the consensus revenue estimating numbers. That's the group of economists and professors and state research folks that all get together and decide how much money they think the state's going to bring in over the next 6 months or so, and they project out a few years, but they meet in April and they meet again in November, and they tell us what they think the economic outlook is going to be. They do that work in late April, and so typically we've in recent years held off on budget until the veto session, so we know exactly how much money we might have. And they came back and did their work, and they said they think there might be a difference of about $15 million over the next 3 years, so not a huge difference in terms of what the projections have been to this point. So when we go back, we'll still have to do the budget, which most of the negotiations, I think, had pretty well concluded. There's a few more sticking points, but those should get worked out. There'll be an attempt, I think, to override the governor's veto on Senate Bill 67. That's the one about medication abortions and the potential for reversal, doctors notifying women that there may be a chance that they could reverse that procedure if they don't take the second dose of the medication and take an estrogen supplement. And then I don't know that we'll do anything on taxes. There's been talk between the governor and other groups about a compromise on taxes, but Karen might know more about that than I do. I understand that the discussions kind of fell apart. I think the Senate will have some theatrics on Medicaid expansion due to a motion made by the minority leader, but I don't believe there are the votes there to bring that bill up and work it this year, and Senate leadership is already committed to doing an interim committee to develop the Kansas version of that. And my guess would be that issue will be run next session instead of this year. So the senator did mention the case that came down yesterday from the Supreme Court, and that is a really broad case, and some have said sweeping. I think the Attorney General's statement was very much on point. The court basically looked at Section 1 and Section 2 of the Kansas Bill of Rights and found a more expansive right to an abortion than what the United States Supreme Court found using the 14th Amendment. They used the phrase natural rights, and the actual text of the section of the Constitution is all men are possessed of equal and inalienable natural rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Supreme Court takes that phrase, inalienable natural rights, and stretches that to include the right to an abortion. They then use there are 3 levels of constitutional scrutiny in our country. So when the courts test a law and say, hey, is this constitutional or not? The easiest bar is rational basis review. That's the one that's easiest for the state to get over and say our law is constitutional. There's an intermediate scrutiny that usually deals with gender and sexual orientation discrimination. And then there's strict scrutiny, which is the highest level. It's the hardest burden for the state to carry to show that its enactment is constitutional. And it has to have a compelling government interest and a narrowly tailored means to accomplish that compelling interest. Strict scrutiny is very rarely used unless a law discriminates on its face against someone's race, someone's national origin, someone's religion. Kansas, I think, in the concurring opinion by Justice Biles, said I think there's only 2 other cases where Kansas courts have ever applied the strict scrutiny standard. It's very rarely used. So for the court to apply strict scrutiny in this case was very unique and nearly unprecedented. There are a handful of other states around the country who have come to similar conclusions. Iowa was probably the most recent a couple of years ago. West Virginia, Montana, Alaska, California, Minnesota, and I think maybe Massachusetts have all had similar state law cases. Few of them have gone as far as our court did with strict scrutiny. Many have adopted the United States Supreme Court standard of undue burden. That is, does the enactment create an undue burden on the right to an abortion, which is a lesser standard than strict scrutiny. And that's what one of the concurring opinions said, is we think that that's where the standard should have been in Kansas, not clear up here at strict scrutiny. For the court to develop a theory of natural rights, and basically natural rights are what the court says they are at this point, we will see a flood of litigants in this state seeking natural rights protection for a whole host of things that are undefined. We simply don't know what that phrase means, and it's amorphous enough that it means whatever the Supreme Court wants it to mean. This is a very dangerous precedent, not because necessarily the issue, people have their strong feelings on both sides of the abortion question, but the jurisprudential side of this, what the court has opened here in terms of Pandora's box, is truly frightening from a litigation and public policy standpoint. And I have grave concerns about that. As someone who's pro-life, I have grave concerns about the court finding a right to an abortion in the Constitution. And I think what Kansas will end up doing is what almost every other state where the court has made this determination has done, and that is to put this question before the public and let the people decide whether they agree that their Constitution contains a right to an abortion through the form of a constitutional amendment. And I suspect that will be on the ballot sometime in 2020 for the people to make that decision. Some states have adopted a constitutional amendment, like Tennessee, that overrode their court. Some have not, like Iowa. But I think that this is important enough and momentous enough that the public and the people ought to have a chance to weigh in on this question and decide whether they agree that in 1861 that the Wyandotte Convention meant to include a right to abortion when they said that humans have natural rights. So I think that's the way you'll see that play out. There'll be a lot of discussion, there'll be a lot of words written about this and a lot of people making statements, but I think ultimately that's probably the next few steps in this process.
We're going into May 1st without having a budget passed yet. What work needs to be done in order to make this budget happen before the session is over?
Yeah, sure. As Representative Finch said, that they are close in negotiations. Both chambers have passed some form of a budget. It's currently in conference committee. The chair, vice chair, and ranking from the House and the Senate are negotiating right now. They were extremely close. In fact, we thought we'd have it before we left, but it broke down on two issues. One of the senators wanted to make sure that we paid a bill that was due. I'm not sure which one it was specifically. I think it was the loan that was taken out last year.
PMIB.
Yes, PMIB. And then the other, it was another issue that I think they can come to terms with. It's going to be interesting. I don't know. They may try to. I think that can be done fairly quickly. The rumor mill is that the Senate is proposing that we are out within a couple of days. So I have a feeling leadership is going to try to push that through as soon as possible to get that budget complete and get us out of there, because that is our only obligation by statute, is to pass that.
Yeah, look, it's not unusual to be at May 1st and not have a budget. As I said, that's pretty standard operating procedure now, because we wait for those April numbers to make sure we can dial in the budget as closely as possible. That was even more important when we didn't have much of an ending cash balance. Now we do this year, but if you look at the projections, and I'll just run through them with you real quick because I think it's interesting. The approved fiscal year 19 budget, remember the state fiscal year runs July 1 to June 30, and it's always labeled by the year that it ends in. So we're in fiscal year 19 right now. July 1 of this year, we'll start fiscal year 2020, okay? So right now in fiscal year 19, our ending cash balance is projected to be $877 million, almost $900 million. That's a pretty healthy ending cash balance for our budget. Next year, that ending cash balance will be $663 million. So we'll be down $200 million. The year after that, it will be $284 million. We'll be cutting it in half. And the year after that will be $75 million underwater, and in 2023 will be $400 million underwater. So this is what the senator was talking about, and it's why it's important that we try to get these budgets as right as we can. Much of this is the new school spending. There is some other new spending in there. Human services caseloads take a lot of our money. CAPERS payments take a lot of the state's money. But in fiscal year 2016, the state budget, the state general fund was $6.1 billion. In fiscal year 2022, it will be $8.1 billion, a 33% increase in 6 years' time. That's not sustainable in a state with 3 million people. It's simply not sustainable. Whatever you think of the funding priorities, wherever you come down on them, we can't afford to continue to see growth like that in spending without significant increases in taxes. And people I hear from say, I'm taxed to death. I don't want to pay any more taxes. I don't want to pay any more property taxes. I don't want to pay more sales taxes. I don't want to pay any more income taxes. So there is a real reckoning coming in fiscal year 2022 when the legislature in 2021 sits down in their seats and has to come up with a budget. We'll be right back where we were in the Brownback era of not having enough money to cover our bills.
And if I may, that is if the court and the legislature choose to accept the current funding for K through 12.
Right. That's assuming we don't get rejected again.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
The media focuses right now primarily on issues like education and the budget, but there are a lot of other bills that have passed recently or that both sides are working on. Could you highlight some bills that will benefit us in the next few years that maybe you haven't talked about yet or we haven't heard much about because of some of the other bigger issues?
Oh, man, yeah. The Farm Bureau health insurance bill passed, which I think was supported by our local Farm Bureau here, and that will not replace all other types of health care, but it will give farmers and ranchers an opportunity to try to pick up a health care product that in Tennessee is running about 30% cheaper than other health insurances. It does have some concerns. People have raised concerns about pre-existing conditions and the fact that it's not a regulated product. But it is a one market-based solution, and I don't think, we've talked about this ad nauseum, there's no silver bullet for healthcare. Whether people believe Medicaid expansion will solve everything or people believe single payer will solve everything, there is no magic solution for all of the problems in healthcare, and this is one small piece of that. But I think it's going to be beneficial for folks here in Franklin County. We had some criminal justice fixes. We had the Wetridge fix, which fixes the out-of-state conviction disparity, or tries to. Our Supreme Court has found on numerous occasions in our Court of Appeals that out-of-state convictions for the same crime, so you commit a robbery in Kansas or you commit a robbery in Missouri, but you come to Kansas and commit a second crime, the person who committed their first crime in Kansas gets a harsher punishment than the one who did it in Missouri, which makes no sense, and that's why we've been trying to fix that. The case is called Wetridge, and we've been trying to fix that, and I think we may have a solution to it this year. I'm proud of the work that was done on that. Look closer to home, we passed a bill for the animal shelter concerning their audit requirements with the Secretary of State. It's going to save them $10,000 or $12,000 and help them to provide more services in the community. We got a bill for the county sheriff that he wanted concerning animals who were taken into custody. We had a big case here where we took about 50 horses into custody, and then the statutory requirement wouldn't allow us to collect the bond and the costs here in Franklin County. It had to be out in the various counties where the horses were housed, so it created more of a fiscal nightmare for him. And then we did a little bill for Central Heights School District. They were having to pay back, they were not getting the reimbursement for their motor vehicle fuels tax when they were buying gasoline for school vehicles. The statute said if you put gas into a school bus, you get your motor vehicle fuels tax paid back. And it's not a lot, but it amounted to about $3,500, I think, over 3 years for them. And we changed the statute so that any school vehicle used to transport students could receive that reimbursement. So for special needs students who may ride on a bus where there's only one person, or a special van. We wanted to make sure that they were getting the benefit of that policy. So those were 3 bills that we did closer to home that I was proud of to get through, and those have all been signed by the governor now.
We have quite a bit of legislation, not just that, some that hasn't passed also, but I don't know, I wasn't aware, I learned this year that there's a class that you can take for defensive driving and you get a decrease on your insurance policy. Some insurance policies will be up to 10%. I was happy that we got that legislation passed and you helped with it. Yes, and so it was good. There are things that are going well for the legislature. You do always hear the negative, it seems like, but there are some good policy that's been passed. One of the things that I've been working on, well, with tax issues, I've talked a little bit about that. Property tax is an issue for the state, and I've told this group and others that less than 2% of your property tax on average goes to the state of Kansas. And because of that, it all stays local. It's a local issue, but they keep saying, well, Topeka is telling us to do this. Well, is that PVD or is that the legislature? So we need to start clearing up that language, making it easier to protest your taxes, making the process itself more simplified. And then also, one of the things that we did take up legislation in the Senate, and I'm hoping that the House has an opportunity to look at it this year. Maybe they won't until next year, but we passed a bill that would freeze property tax for low-income seniors and disabled veterans, over 50% disabled. I'm all about fair government, that it should be the same across the board, but we're not going to get this all at once. So we need to start chipping away as to how we're going to handle the issue with property tax. We are literally, people on a fixed income are being taxed out of their homes. It is, again, heart-wrenching. And so this is some of the action that we took quickly to try to pass that and address that issue. The other thing might not be on your radar, but the Rural Opportunity Zone for Kansas. There's 70-some counties in Kansas that if anybody moves in out of state, they get to not pay state income tax for maybe up to 5 years, depending on what year they moved here and what year the program is in. I did make an amendment on the bill to put Franklin County in. It started out as small rural counties, and I consider Franklin a rural county. We may not be one of the smaller ones, but we should be in that program. So I'm hoping that we can get that passed too. It's just, I don't think anybody moves to the state because of zero income tax. But other counties have it, and again, it's a fair and level playing field. So that's what I'm trying to do, is to make it so that it's fair. If the program does continue, I absolutely want to make sure that Franklin County's in it. And I would also, well, I just want to touch real quick on the, we did talk a little bit about the court case that, with the pro-life issue. We did have the abortion bill that was vetoed. But, you know, in layman's terms and quite simple, our court has gone rogue. This Supreme Court, the same Supreme Court, let me remind you, overturned the Carr-Brother case. We had an eyewitness for that case. That was a horrific case in Wichita where youth were killed, tortured, and then killed. We had an eyewitness, and our Supreme Court overturned that case. They just overturned another death penalty case within the last 2 weeks. So they have gone off the reservation. I heard a quote, and it sounds a little bit harsh, but it kind of tells it. It says that our Supreme Court is allowing us to kill babies, but they are babying killers. It does sound harsh, but that is how we are going as a state, and we need to stand up to them. We need to take action.
Senator Tyson, you had touched a little bit about rural development, and I know at the town hall that we had recently, the Lieutenant Governor talked about some of the efforts that are being made to improve rural development and to protect our communities in the rural areas. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those needs are and what you think that this effort might help lead to?
Generally, economic development in rural areas in Kansas, is that kind of the
Yeah.
gist of it? Yeah. We in the House created a rural revitalization committee and put Representative Don Heineman as its chair. And Representative Heineman's a former majority leader in the House and longtime legislator from Dighton, Kansas, and understands challenges that rural communities face. They've done a lot of work and looked at a whole lot of issues. I think they've kind of settled on increasing access to broadband in rural areas as their major focus for this year. And that's going to be essential. You know, whether you're talking about a farming operation that needs to have access to market information, or so much of farming now is done with drones and soil temperature and probe tests and all kinds of cool things that when you go on the Farm Bureau tours and look at these farming operations, that they're more technologically advanced a lot of times than some of the offices that you go into. So I think broadband access will be important for that. You know, Kansas is, and we're all in this together, and we've all got to work together to find out what the solution is. I wish I had it. The reality is that we're part of a now 60 to 70 year trend in this country following World War II, where people have moved from what was the industrial Northeast out into the southern and western parts of our country. People migrate. They want to go where the weather's nice. They want to go where there's a beach. They want to go where there's mountains. And where they're not staying is a lot of times in the plain states. They're leaving those places. And so we have to figure out what it is that will both attract people to come here and keep the ones that we have. I think a big part of that is creating opportunity. I think workforce development is going to be a big part of that. I looked at a program from Tennessee where Tennessee granted basically universal community college or technical school to every Tennessee high school graduate. The cost of that program in Kansas would be about $50 million if we were to do that same program here. We can't come up with the other $50 million without raising taxes because of the budget profile I just showed you. That's why we held meetings with superintendents, some of whom are in the plaintiff districts for the school funding lawsuit, to say, can we spend some of this money doing some other things? Can we innovate beyond just doing the K-12 thing? And our school board has been an innovator on that. Our school board and superintendent have reached out and developed agreements with Neosho County Community College to try to get students there. What I'd like to do is see the state be able to use more of its resources to help those kinds of collaborations and less in terms of solving lawsuits and dealing with kind of doing things the way we've always done them. I'd like to have more freedom to innovate with those kinds of programs, because I think workforce development's a huge part of that. Broadband access is a huge part of that. Obviously, our tax policy plays some role in that, but I think the senator's right. People probably aren't moving here for zero income tax, but I think that retirees do look at leaving the state because the way we tax Social Security benefits is more disadvantageous than other states. Property tax burdens can be higher here than in other places. And so I think we have to look at a real comprehensive dive into our tax code and see if we're doing things right or if we need to change some things to try to keep those people here.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. I actually approached the governor. The last time we've had a deep study on tax in Kansas was during the Graves administration, a blue ribbon study. I asked the governor if she would consider such a study. I've also approached legislative leadership on that too. We need a deep dive on how we are taxing. And if you look at the Kansas tax statutes, it specifically spells out, one of the items that I've worked on for a couple of years now is we have some hospices that have no sales tax and others, nonprofit hospices, that do pay sales tax. We have a Rotary Club in Wichita that does not pay sales tax, while the rest of them in the state of Kansas do pay sales tax. It makes no sense. And so we need to clean that language up. And the Senate Tax Committee has been moving towards this, not naming specific entities, but instead writing the language so that somebody qualifies, they qualify. They don't need to contact their legislator or hire a lobbyist in order to get their group listed and have a tax exemption or know that they pay tax. I'm just so glad you mentioned that. As far as rural development, it's near and dear to my heart. We have a wonderful lifestyle here in Kansas. In fact, in a majority of our communities, you don't have to lock your doors still. You know your neighbors. You know what's going on in the area. That lifestyle is so important to us, and I think that draws people back to the state, or people who left the state for jobs or school. That if we do have the broadband, the technology, that they're able to come home and telecommute and work, that's the way to bring people back to Kansas. With the technology with farming now, if you think in the past, almost every 80 acres had a family on it. And we're not going to go back to that, not with the way technology is for farming today. So our rural communities need to figure out how they are a draw to bring people back to these areas. I think it's lifestyle, the way we live, the way we have wonderful schools. I know that the nation is hearing that school funding is horrible in Kansas. But look at the reality and look at the numbers. We are some of the best schools. Go tour the schools. Go the facility here in Ottawa. It's beautiful. It's amazing. Williamsburg, one of the best programs. I brag on the elementary. They start from seed to mouth and teach the kids and use that to teach math, sciences, English. Their kids are engaged. I mean, we have innovative school districts, and it shows in Kansas. So let's start touting how wonderful we are. I've said that I was a cheerleader for many years. Well, I'm a cheerleader for the state of Kansas now. I love Kansas, and that's what's going to bring people here and for them want to come here. We have a great state. Yes, we have disagreements. We do not agree 100% on every issue. I tell you, my husband and I don't agree 100% on every issue. But we talk about them, we work through them, and we make this state the best possible state it can be. And that's how we bring people back.
You talked a little bit about education. We've talked a lot about K through 12. What we don't talk a lot about is what is happening as far as funding for our community colleges and for our four-year colleges and universities. What is the legislature looking at doing to support those colleges and to keep those costs from getting to a point where they're not accessible anymore?
One of the things that we did, if you don't mind, a few years ago we passed, and if you talk to the schools, they refer to it by the bill number. But in Kansas, every 2 years we start over with the bill numbers. So, but what it is was a technical program that allows high school students to become certified while they're in high school. They don't just take English or calculus or any college classes now. They're allowed to take technical courses such as welding, cosmetology, and they can come out certified. That helps the Kansas economy. It helps these students. They don't come out with major loans. It's a direction that we need to take a deep look at. Not everybody wants to go to college or needs to go to college, but for those that do, the opportunities are there now for them to take college classes in high school, and I know a lot of them are. In fact, I've talked to several students, and they're coming out with their freshman year in college complete, or some of them are even as ambitious as to go in as second semester sophomores or first year juniors because they have completed that many classes at the college level. So that if they take advantage of those programs, that can help. You know, if we focus on education in the classroom, I think that we can just make sure that the money's getting to where it needs to be. I know we do have some issues with the university. One of them with K-State, and I'll bring this up quickly, for those in rural and agriculture, and actually anybody that owns a pet could be impacted by this eventually. Kansas State, if you look at the students that have entered the veterinary program, the majority of them are out of state because they pay out of state tuition. So if you are a Kansas student now trying to get into a K-State veterinary college, you're at a disadvantage. And if you are a male student trying to get in to K-State, you're at a larger disadvantage from Kansas. So we just need some common sense solutions. We're going to have a shortage of veterinaries if we continue down this path, and it's something that we need to address.
If you, and I think I've held this chart up before and showed you all, if you look at this chart that shows major categories of spending in the state, the black line at the top is K-12. The green line, almost all the way at the bottom, is higher ed. Higher ed's about 11% of the state budget. K-12 is about 52, 53% now. Higher ed's about to get eclipsed by Capers. That's the blue line underneath, if you're wondering what's coming up there from underneath. So when you ask, what do we do for higher ed? What can we do for higher ed? When 52% of the state budget is quote-unquote constitutionally protected and cannot be changed, and with the education bill that was just passed this year is going to be guaranteed to grow at least by the rate of inflation forever, which could be $50 to $150 million annually, there's not much room left to grow higher ed spending in the state of Kansas. As I said, I had a project that I would have loved to have seen happen. It cost $50 million. We don't have $50 million laying around. And what do you do? The difficult choice is then, okay, I want to do this program, but it costs $50 million. What can I cut? Well, I can't take any money away from K-12 because it's going to lead to another lawsuit if we do that. Do I cut DCF? No, we can't do that. We've got foster kids sleeping on the floor. Do I cut corrections? No, we've got prison riots at El Dorado, and we can't afford to pay our prison guards. Do I cut KDOT? No, because we've already missed out on the next 10-year highway plan, and we're behind the 8 ball on highway maintenance. Do I cut highway patrol? No. Do I cut Department of Ag? It's less than 2% of the state budget, and yet that's our state's leading industry. What do you cut? Then you come to the conclusion that you can't cut anything. So what taxes am I going to increase? Well, can't increase property taxes. You can't increase the sales tax. It's already amongst the highest in the nation in Kansas. Do you increase the income tax? Well, the people already say we pay enough in income tax. We don't want to pay any more income tax. And many Kansans who are itemized filers already saw an increase in income tax. So the answers are not easy to come by. But the reality is that we are seeing compression pressures in our budget for everything that's not K-12, because just to keep up with inflation for things like higher ed will require ever-increasing amounts of spending that, as I showed you, we don't have. Our ending cash balance goes negative here in 2 years. So I don't know that I have great news. I don't know that I can be as optimistic as I normally like to be about the future of all the other areas of the state budget. And it's simply not, people say just raise taxes, just raise income taxes. What's the problem? The problem is that we are at a point where the tax burden on individuals in Kansas, all taxes combined, puts Kansas in the bottom half of states in the nation for the amount of taxation that people pay here. We have a graying population. Our population's getting older. We have a population that's dealing with legacy costs from agricultural investments. People bought farmland, people have houses, and they pay taxes on those things. And as they get older, their income becomes fixed. And we say at the same time we want to attract young people to come here, to buy a house, to invest in Kansas, to make this their future. You can't do both. You can't continually increase taxes to pay for an ever-increasing amount of spending and still be attractive as a destination for people to come and make investment. So it's not as simple as saying, well, just raise taxes and we can do this. And if you do, it ends up becoming this thing where you're constantly a snake eating its tail. You're spending more, so you're raising more taxes, so you're spending more, so you're raising more taxes. And that doesn't benefit long-term the people of this state or the programs that we've already invested in. So I don't know what the answer is, Diana. I'm hopeful that we can work together to try to find some balance and to maybe do some things differently in the future.
Okay, you have had 40 minutes to think up some questions. And it has to be a question, but does anyone have a question for our legislators? And it's a question, right? Not a comment. It's a question.
We'll take comments.
I already know how you both feel about expanding Medicare. I'm not going to ask you to rehash that again or give your reasons. What I am interested in is what your opinion would be if it was to come up to a vote, if it was to get out of a committee, if it was on the House floor. Would it pass, in your opinion?
Well, it already passed the House floor this session.
Pass the Senate?
I'm not sure at this point. The reason, the bill itself would pass. There are 21 votes for the bill, but the question in the Senate is procedural at this point. It takes 2/3, it takes 24 votes to pull the bill out of committee, and then it takes 27 votes to bring it above the line. What you're doing then is you're saying, I completely disregard for it was leadership in the House got rolled, and usually there's consequences for that. So it's going to be interesting. I'm not afraid of my leadership.
You've already been rolled.
Yeah, I've been rolled, and I will take them on because my job is to defend this 12th district and Kansas. That's who I was elected by, and I keep my campaign promises. That's, how I campaigned is how I represent. And you want somebody that strong. You don't want somebody that's going to go up and say, because their leadership asked them to do something or their governor asked them to do something. You try to work with them, but you don't turn over your vote to them. They do not own your vote. But not all legislators think that way. So you're asking me if there's 24 votes to get it out of committee. I think there are those 24 votes. Then you're asking me, are there 27 votes to bring it above the line and roll the majority leader? That one is where it's questionable. I don't know. It appears they could have those votes, that the votes could be there for that. I'm not sure at this point. I've heard the majority leader is working very diligently to try and get people to vote no. I do know that I've heard state representatives that have said, well, the bill that passed the House, we can't afford it. Even though they voted for it, we can't afford it. So that was disheartening. I've been working with other senators and talking to them throughout the break. I've always said this, Kansas solution, targeted solution, that's what we need on this. There's been a proposal, there's a bill in the Senate that would take foster care kids and it would move them to the program so that they are some of the first individuals that are covered. And what it would do is it would take 10,000 of the foster kids off and then allow 10,000 people instead of 150,000 people at once, and to make a gradual change in order to see what the state can afford and what the state can handle. You keep hearing that this is going to save the rural hospitals, that this is going to create jobs, it's going to be wonderful for the state, but that is debatable. And if we all knew that was true, then we would all be voting for this. But we know that the facts show a different story. The rural hospitals that have closed are not as a result of not having Medicaid. In fact, most of them will admit that if Medicaid expansion would have occurred, it may have kept them open a little longer, it would not have saved them. If the locals are not using the local hospital, it's not going to help. This program will not help. One of the things that I mentioned at the forum that we had here was I would love to see as part of the targeted solution, the reimbursement rate for rural hospitals to be higher than what they would be at the urban hospitals. Because if that is what we're using this program for, is to keep the rural hospitals open, then why wouldn't their reimbursement rate be at a higher rate? Because that would help those hospitals. There are so many things that we need to look at in this, and the Senate has said, and they will take a deep dive and look at it for a Kansas targeted solution. I'm all for that. We just need to be common sense about this. I don't know if the votes are there. We'll see. We didn't have the votes for a veto override for the Senate Bill 22. In fact, 2 conservatives dropped off. I'm still trying to figure that one out. For a tax decrease, 2 conservatives refused to vote for it. One, because they said that the definition of food was not accurate. Well, that could be tweaked. We could come back and change that. That was not a reason to vote no in my book. I've been trying to get sales tax on food lowered since I was elected. We've got it past one chamber or the other, but we can never get it past both chambers. The other item that they dropped off of was because of the online sales tax. If anybody asks you, that is not a tax increase, because right now under state statute, if the vendor does not collect the sales tax, you are obligated as a purchaser to pay that sales tax. So it should be a wash. That's not a tax increase to add language that requires the vendor to collect the sales tax online. But we didn't have the votes for the veto override.
Couple things on the expansion question. It was a slip of the tongue. I think you said Medicare expansion, but it raises the point that what the Kansas Hospital Association has said, what would actually help rural hospitals most in Kansas is if the federal government would increase the Medicare reimbursement rate. It has been stagnant for more than a decade, and that is by far the bigger problem in terms of keeping rural hospitals open. And that is a federal solution. So I would encourage you, if you're active on this issue, be active on the Medicare reimbursement rate issue as well, and contacting our federal delegation, because that, according to our hospital folks, would have a greater impact on keeping health care in rural areas. So I think that's important to note. The other thing I would note is that the House bill that left the House had a premium payment on it, about $25 a month. That people were supposed to pay, and that was advertised as being worth $39 million, and basically said, oh, that'll make the program neutral. It won't cost us anything. In fact, those budget numbers I gave you earlier about what happens in the out years where we go underwater, the projected expenditure for Medicaid, in that year is $1.8 million and $1.9 million. But what the Kansas Health Institute tells us is that Medicaid expansion in Kansas will actually cost somewhere around $50 million a year. So understand those projections that we're building the budgets around for the out years is $1.8 million, not $50 million. And Kansas Health Institute is a fairly objective source on the data for that, and they say about $50 million. You can build in a premium requirement like the House bill did and say you got to pay $25 a month. But under federal law, if someone doesn't pay their premium, the remedy is that they're off Medicaid for 90 days, and then you have to let them back on. So not paying your premium it's not going to be guaranteed. B, it's probably not collectible in most instances. Nobody's going to chase $25 if somebody's not paying it. And third, the worst you can do is say, well, you're off the system for 90 days, and then they get back on. So the premium is not the cure-all. As the senator said, if they're going to dig in an interim committee and actually work on this, it's one piece of the puzzle. Indiana uses a premium, but they have a 2-tiered system. If you want vision and dental, you have to pay the premium. And if you don't pay it, you just drop down to the base level of coverage. So there are a lot of wrinkles. It is an incredibly complicated policy. And I think that what the majority leader in the Senate has talked about, doing an interim committee and trying to come up with that solution, I think that passes fairly early. If they come up with some kind of solution in the next legislative session. I think trying to cram it through now, based on the budget challenges that we have ahead, and trying to build a bill on the floor of the Kansas Senate without having all of the details, without having all of the careful deliberation that a $50 million annual expenditure deserves, is important. And I saw a stat this morning, I'll throw this out in the last comment on this. 150,000 Kansans would benefit from Medicaid expansion. Kansas Health Institute says no, it's 130,000, and 55,000 of those folks already have private insurance. So it's not 150,000 Kansans that would benefit. And I think the statistics out there are being manipulated a little bit to try to build a case for something, whether it be rural hospital, whether it be the number of people who would benefit. The actual expansion population that doesn't currently have private insurance is somewhere around 75,000 people. And I think the Lieutenant Governor said about 500 folks here in Franklin County.
Yeah.
So,
And one of the proposals that I've heard in the Senate is that we do have a waiting list now, and making those folks a priority on the expansion so that they go on first. And it makes sense.
Any other questions?
Yeah. So, kind of a bleak picture financially. But my question is that there are a lot of states out there that have the low or no income tax at all, or lower taxes, and people are fleeing there from all over the country, including from even warm states with beaches. They're fleeing that state at rapid rates. How do we keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result without trying to find a change that's going to work for Kansas?
Well, I actually, you guys have heard me say this. The wasteful spending up there, it is absolutely true. There is wasteful spending. And a prime example, the new Secretary of Agriculture, I just applaud him. He has done a great job. Our previous administration allowed this Department of Agriculture to have, was it 2 or 3 assistant secretaries? Prior, there was only 1 assistant secretary to the secretary, but they increased administration. That's just a small example. And the first thing that this Secretary of Ag did was said, I'm not going to hire any assistants. I'm going to see what I need in order to get my job done and see where I can take care of those, and then I'll see if I need to hire someone or not. Just common sense management. I mean, it's great. He's doing an excellent job. And I hope that other departments and agencies start to take a deep dive at this. We've got, I think it was a $180 million IT contract that was sole sourced, wasn't even put out for bid. So it just was given to a company that had been doing some business with the state. And now, as a result of that, I approached the secretary when he was considering doing this, asked him not to, said he was going to tie our hands and put us in a bind, and he absolutely has. Every time we attempt to change tax legislation now for the Department of Revenue, we come back with a $190 an hour service fee. So they give us an estimate on how many hours it's going to take, and then multiply that by $190 an hour. It's tied our hands. I tell you, there's wasteful spending up there. I know I get into the weeds too much. I apologize for that. But I am absolutely convinced we can save the taxpayers' money. We're not doing it right, and you're right. We keep doing the same thing. So one of the things that I have done and am researching right now is, why do we keep basing our budget off of estimates? And most states do that, but there are some states that have other equations. One of the things that I had proposed on the school funding was, we kept basing our school funding off of an anticipated student count. I asked, why don't we go back and use the actual count from the prior year? Yes, it may be off by a few students, but at least it's an actual number that we're not making a fuzzy equation out of it. And so let's try to do that with the budget process also. I've looked at it. I found Nevada is a possible solution for us. I need to do a deeper dive into it before I propose it. But that's what we got to address the budget process. Otherwise, we do keep doing things the same way we are.
I think waste is one component. I think the question was more of a macro question about, states where people are moving and what do we need to do? And I guess probably in the time that I've served, one of the maxims there in Topeka, and it's true everywhere, is follow the money. And if you want to know why things keep getting done the same way over and over again, because there's a lot of money behind the groups that keep pushing for us to do the same thing over and over again. And that often is spend more money. Spend more money where I want you to spend more money. We saw that even in the midst of the Brownback administration. It was spend more money where I want to spend more money, even though we're having these tax cuts. And now you don't have the restraint of the tax cuts, so it's kind of more unfettered. We're seeing huge increases in the K-12 budget. We've got a huge push by folks who are well-funded to say expand Medicaid and spend additional money there. And then you've got natural inflation pressures that exist in a budget where 90 cents of every dollar goes to education or human services. 90 cents of every dollar goes to education or human services. When you say no to something in this state, you are absolutely goring someone's ox. And they show up, usually with a lobbyist or two. They have some postcards or a slick social media campaign to tell you all the terrible things that you're doing because you're not giving more money to this thing. I mean, we literally get told that we are killing people because of the state budget. Think about that. Think about that. And then you think, well, why is it that a majority of people would just go along to get along and vote for more spending or vote for doing whatever it is that this interest group pressures them to do? Because it's difficult for many people to stand up to that repeatedly and say no. It's difficult to take an unpopular stance. It's difficult to stand before people in your district and say, look, I appreciate that we have a different opinion about this, but based on the information and facts I have, I don't think it's in the state's or your best interest for me to vote for this. And people get angry and people say rude and nasty things about it, and that's part of the business. But the reality is it's not going to change until we say, okay, wait a minute. In a state budget where it truly is a zero-sum game, some things have to be more important than other things. And we're willing to prioritize this thing over that thing and actually defend the people who do that. And a lot of times we see all of the effort, all the money, right up until the vote's taken and this group gets what they want, and then they disappear. And then all we hear is from the next wave crashing up on the shore saying, we want more money now for this thing. And it's just a cycle that repeats and repeats and repeats, and what you get is a state budget that has an expenditure line that looks like that. Just goes up and up and up. So when you wonder why we keep doing it the same way, that's why.
And the interesting part, if I may add to that, is many of those people that we hear from are taxpayer funded. So it's taxpayer money asking for more taxpayer money. It's a vicious cycle, and it needs to be addressed.
One of the things that in the Speaker Pro Tem's office, we meet with a lot of groups who are coming in to make budget presentations. Board of Regents, community college presidents, community action groups, whomever might be coming in. And I, about a month into the session, I started to give them kind of this stock joke that nobody ever comes into my office and says, no, we're good, we got enough money. Every single group that comes in needs more money. And often they make a very compelling case about why they do. We would do these good things if you just gave us more money. So it's hard.
Yeah, and I think almost every department and agency has a communications person now and a legislative liaison, quote unquote lobbyist. Every single department up there. So the dynamics have changed. We need to get back to common sense and what is government for. We help those that cannot help themselves, but and I'll bring up the fraud and the abuse with the systems that we do have now. That is a major cost to our state and our nation. We need to address it. Sorry.
Okay, that brings us to 11 o'clock, and so we're wrapping up our legislative coffee today. Thank you again to Ottawa Area Chamber of Commerce and the Legislative Action Committee, the Franklin County Farm Bureau Association, AT&T, the Franklin County Democrats for cookies. Please load your pockets as you walk out the door. The City of Ottawa for providing the space and the coffee. Don't put the coffee in your pockets. And again to Matt Simonson for making this exist in perpetuity on the internet. Will you two be around for just a few minutes?
Yes.
Okay, so if you have any more questions or comments or compliments or frowny faces, please come see your legislators afterwards. Thank you.